MS Pearce, columnist and feature writer at OnlySky. How are you?
I am very well, thank you very much. Very well indeed. Excited to be a part of this new venture into the world of proper media. So yeah, no, I'm in a good place.
And do you feel that in moving into this new platform, do you feel like there were restraints that you had on your writing before that you don't have now?
Interesting. So before, I used to write for Patheos Non-Religious, which was the non-religious channel for the Patheos Network, which is a big interfaith dialogue network. And that was fine. I could actually write anything I wanted for years and years. And it was great because I used to love writing politics, philosophy, attacking religion, stuff that I just wanted to talk about, anything. I had a free reign to talk about anything there. And then, of course, we heard that with the new CEO that took over, who's an evangelist, it was like, okay, you can't attack religion and you can't do politics. It's like, okay, well, that's essentially the two major parts of the two major inspirations for my writing. So with OnlySky, it's back to being able to write about what I want. And the great thing is it's a kind of media platform that is open season for talking about anything, but with a secular lens. But it doesn't have to be something that it's about atheism or about religion in America or Britain or anywhere. It can just be, like I wrote a piece just now about nuclear fission, and the new research has come out to show that actually it's pretty viable, and they've just done 5 seconds of fission. And that's pretty amazing. So that had nothing to do with atheism or philosophy, but it's just really interesting bit of science news. There you go.
So kind of it's post-religious in the sense that everyone there is already secular, and this is just regular news that just happens to be coming from a secular slant.
Yeah, and
when that all media has bias.
Yes, so when the opportunity arises, of course, that where something needs a secular slant or is interesting to be given, to be seen through the secular lens, then obviously, yeah, that's brilliant. But as a news organization, sometimes there are just bits of news or bits of commentary that are just relevant no matter where I'm coming from and where the
irrespective of yeah.
But I love it. I love the fact that, I mean, this is needed, right? You've got media platforms, particularly in America, that you've got huge amounts of media platforms that are tailored to the religious audience, and that feed into this power asymmetry, whereby the lobbying potential of the religious organizations in America absolutely drown out the lobbying potentials of the non-religious. And so therefore there's very little non-religious representation. People are afraid, politicians are afraid to announce that they're naturalistic or atheistic.
Well, what there is, like, so from my position, looking at the news landscape, right, we can kind of discount CNN as being, CNN is not influencing the narrative the same way as that Fox and MSNBC are, but Fox is more than happy to take on a religious bent and full-throatedly be Christian nation, blah blah blah, whereas the left's answer to Fox, MSNBC, is nominally secular, but not. It's not pushing the position because it can't turn away the advertisers who are trying to hit the 70% that are still Christian, right?
Exactly. And you've got much smaller organizations like TYT, Young Turks, who are internet, based media organizations, but it's just not in the same league. There's nothing really out there that, when you think one day, wouldn't it be great to have a secular or non-religious reporter in the White House, asking questions in the same way that Catholic media organizations get to do that and ask about abortion, in the press conference to Jen Psaki or whatever, just over and over the same kind of thing. Well, actually, it would be nice to balance that out with some non-religious secular views within that context.
No, I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
And most of I imagine most of most of the people who are asking those kinds of, who are from non-secular news services, were probably asking more science questions than these sort of, you know, social issue questions for a long time. Like, if there are any people doing that sort of reporting, they haven't been asking those questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, the sort of Fox News and these other OAN and Newsmax and all these, but they're going in, they've got culture narratives is what they're all about. So it's like all the questions are geared towards perpetuating culture wars, you know, positions and narratives. Whereas, you know, and as you say, CNN and your mainstream, many of your mainstream media organizations aren't particularly geared to any side of the debate, but it would be nice to get some kind of balance whereby there are questions that will also be to do with, hey, hang on, we've got some issues here with church-state separation. We've got some issues here with, you know, bodily autonomy. We've got some issues with education and evolution. You know, that's been missing. It's been wholly missing. It's only ever incidental if it comes from CNN or MSNBC. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, the networks don't get into the nitty-gritty of state issues. Like, this is part of the huge problem of local newspapers all being bought up by conglomerates and publishing, you know, internet content that tries to appeal to the widest audience. People aren't getting the local information that they really should have if we're trying to really affect change, like, in that way, you know.
Yeah, it's the same with local TV stations in America. What's the company called? It's not Spencer. No. There's a local TV network that's buying up all the local TV.
Yeah, John
and
Oliver did a thing about it.
yes, yeah, and the news readers, even though they're all in all these different states, are reading from the
All
same
reading the same
script.
copy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, it's worrying. And the great thing about OnlySky, it's like, okay, you know, it sounds like grandiose, but it's not delusions of grandeur. It's like we want to change the landscape. We want to change the world for the better. There's no point, you know, setting up an organization and just aiming for here and just like, oh, we're just going to write about stuff. There you go. It's like, no, we're going to write about stuff, but we're also going to give a voice to people who have, as of yet, not really had a voice in any, certainly with regard to any media representation, but also to use that voice to get greater political representation at the top. And it's this kind of symbiotic relationship where it is about changing the political landscape in America and the world. And that's a huge thing to say, but actually it's doable and it needs to be done.
I was also excited to see that we have a fiction category. I threw a couple pieces in there because well, there needs to, there hasn't been, and I don't even know how you would do it, but I think, you know, developing fiction and literature is important. And, you know, back in the 80s and 90s with the secular movement, it was always science fiction.
I think there's a lot that we're trying to do with our writing, even within the feature writing and the columns and the nonfiction, is about telling stories and creating a kind of narrative within our nonfiction pieces in a way that, as bloggers at Patheos, and I know only a small percentage of us were former Patheos bloggers, but you know, you weren't particularly telling stories. Maybe some people were, and trying to, you know, create a voice and create a narrative. But now, actually, we are trying to engage readers by telling stories and you know, presenting our own voices as individual columnists, but also giving voice to different segments of society. And I think that will develop over time. But part of that is also storytelling in traditional form of fiction. And I think that's exciting that we can, as a platform, be so multifaceted and be able to, you know, produce content that is that varied. I think it's fantastic.
I noticed that you and a couple others I think Hammond's been doing it too, have been taking video content and like interviewing each other over Zoom, kind of like we're doing now, and we're all posting this stuff to YouTube, and then we're putting it on the blogs and trying to
Yeah.
engage more different kinds of content that we weren't necessarily taking advantage of over at Pathos.
Well, so over at Pathos, I've had a YouTube channel for like 10 years, but I've just had a couple of old videos on there of just talking head me. I mean, it's all talking head me anyway, but in the downtime of Pathos going down, I basically use that time, and then OnlySky coming up, I use that time to get my YouTube channel started in a, well, not started, but you know, to bring it to fruition. And I had some support of other YouTubers, and I did some series on some of my books. I've done a big old resurrection series on Myth Vision with Derek Lambert, and this has got my sort of audience up to a level which means the channel's monetized, and that's all fantastic. It's another string to my bow. But it's great because it allows, you know, in this age of multimodal multimedia, you know, there are just so many different ways that we can communicate with our audience. So it makes sense to be able to write stuff, to do videos that can act as also audio, to you know, all of these wonderful ways of communicating our ideas. It's fantastic. And this also allows us, as you say, to interview each other. You know, I'm hopefully going to interview you soon. And I've done a couple of people at OnlySky, and hopefully I'm going to continue that. I've got Phil Zuckerman coming up. Yeah, it's really exciting. I love YouTube videos as much as I love writing. It's just another great medium.
So what are the pieces that you've been working on recently? Well, we brought up the A cannot equal not A thing. What were you?
Well, so yeah, so I've just done one on existence, what it means to exist. Like, as we use the word, oh, something exists, like love exists or morality exists. But what does that actually mean? What does to exist mean? And just talk about the different ways that we can use existence or to exist as a verb. So I just write, but that's my normal philosophical stuff.
I think I've used that argument against theists before. Kind of, how can you say that something exists outside of time and space?
Well, yeah, I would say how do abstract ideas exist outside of your mind? So, for example, stuff like you can talk about massive things like mathematics. You can talk about loyalty. You can talk about morality. Any kind of abstract idea. A chair, and I don't mean the matter of the chair. I mean the idea that that is a chair. Like to a cat, that's not a chair. That's a bed. You know, to an alien, that's not a chair. But to me and you, that's a chair, right? So, but if all sentient life died in the universe, would there still be mathematics? Or is that just a language we've created, constructed in our minds that we pass to our minds from mind to mind, and we write things down? But when you read a textbook, that only means something if you as a conceiver are reading it and extracting meaning.
Right. If I write a passage describing what it looks like outside my window, and then I send it to you and you read it, the image that you're going to get in your head it cannot absolutely match exactly what it actually looks like, right?
Sure.
Unless I'm way better at my job than I think I am.
But it will match more if we have a shared cultural background and similar brains, right? So there is a spectrum there. But if we all died, if literally there was no sentient life left in the universe, that passage that you've written will just be atoms. It'll just be paper or whatever. It'll just be matter, right? So ideas only exist in our mind, and when we extract them from the world around us. When you then talk about morality, people talk about objective morality. Well, where does that exist? If it's not in here, is there some ether? Is there some platonic ether where all these ideas exist, like mathematics and morality? And then obviously theists will then say, well, it exists in God. I was like, okay, that's just another mind. So now it's really just another version of subjective.
Yeah, and what does that mind exist in?
Yeah, outside of, yeah. So we only understand minds as emerging from you know, the matter of brain and brain states. So what is it to say that there's a mind that exists outside of time and space? And then you start getting to weird situations. I mean, we're going off on one in philosophy here, but then if causally before you create the universe, right, there's just God, there is no time because there's no time space. You can't, causality requires time. So A causes B causes C, you know, it's separated chronologically. Now, if you don't have time, how can you even cause the universe to begin to exist? How can you think? How can you deliberate? So when you think, there's time, you've got thoughts going across time. You say, oh, I'm going to do this. No, I'm not going to do that. You weigh things up and you say, but if you're God existing without creating anything, then there's only one instant. There's just an instance of God existing. There's no thought, there's no deliberation, there's no deciding, there's no choosing. So if creation happens, which is weird because you can't have causality without time, but if creation happened and God did create the universe, then it's just almost like an instant outpouring of God. There's no thought. So anyway, all that kind of stuff, yeah, that's floats my boat. That's not what I've been writing about hugely, but it's the sort of stuff I will continue to write about. So I wrote a couple of feature pieces recently, one on gene editing, a big old piece because one of my friends, not because, but I wanted to write a piece on gene editing and what's the morality of gene editing, because now it's become a thing where we can do it. So, okay, is it good? Is it bad? And I didn't know. And I love this where you sit down to write an article and it's like, I don't know what I think about this yet, but I'm going to write an article and it will help me understand what I think about it. And then I put out a call to friends on social media who has experienced like giving birth to children where there's some kind of genetic disorder and you've thought about gene editing. And if you could do that, you would do that with a future baby. And I had got quite a few people. And so I interviewed one of my friends and it was just a fascinating article on like, you know, will we do gene editing over here with crops, GMO crops and stuff like that? And that's broadly fine. So why can't we do it with humans? Are we being speciesist? You know, and all these ideas, and it's great just playing with what's right and what's wrong with gene editing, and is it good for changing the color of your baby's eyes or for a life-saving condition? You know, are they the same thing?
I think there's plenty of room for argument about the morality of changing the color of your baby's eyes because it implies some sort of racial hierarchy one way or another.
Yeah,
Problematic in and of itself.
Well, I do see something like that in and of itself, the color of your eyes, I wouldn't really care about. But it's a law of unintended consequences where it's like, well, if everyone decided and then it was cool, suddenly this kind of color was cool of eyes. And then, you know, it's like, well, okay, I can see things might go wrong there. So if you then restrict it to life-saving conditions, then it's a lot safer. It's like, okay, sure, if this baby is to live, then it's only going to live for five tortured years. Let's mess around with the genes. But then you have other questions like, well, if you don't have universal health care, is it only the richest people that can afford it?
Is it more? Yeah. Oh, believe me, the abortion argument, I could go on.
Yeah. And so therefore, you know, there are loads of connected ideas to this, which is like, so I argue broadly that in principle, I've got no objection to it broadly across most areas, but in practice, it can be really problematic, certainly in certain contexts, and so there, it has to be really careful. It's a bit like profiling. So profiling in principle, like philosophically in principle, is fine, which is to say that we've got some finite resources. So I've written a piece on this before. So profiling is highly controversial and for good reason, but in principle, like in British education systems, we use profiling all the time, which it's called free school meals. So what you do is you say, right, if you're earning only this amount of money or under this amount of money and you're on welfare benefits, then you are entitled to free school meals, right? And children who are entitled to free school meals, schools get funding, extra funding for children who claim free school meals, which is to say, if you're at the lowest end of the socioeconomic strata, then a school that has more children at the lower end of socioeconomic strata will get more funding because they are going to have more challenges educationally going forward that they need to overcome. So they'll need more funding to do that. And that is profiling, saying if basically, broadly speaking, if you're poor, you're going to struggle at school more, your schools are going to need more money, right? Okay, that sounds a bit horrible to say it like that, but that's broadly how we partly fund our education system, and it works. Right, and it's needed to try and redress the balance between you know, rich and poor, and equality of opportunity and access to education and whatnot. But then you start saying, so in principle, profiling is good, but then you take it over like, well, you know, if more Black people commit more crime, then we're going to stop them on the streets more. And it's like, okay, well, is this going to cause more problems than it solves? You know, if you agree even with those principles. And then this is the difference between principle and practice. So something like profiling in principle might be philosophically sound, but in practice, it might work in education over there in that context, but it doesn't work over there in stop and search and frisking in ethnic communities, because it causes all sorts of problems. In the same way that gene editing might work in that context, but in that context, there's all sorts of stuff that can go wrong. The practice versus the principle.
Do you think that part of this secular narrative voice that's important is that flexible situational ethic as opposed to biblical prescription coming from the other side?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I as you will well know, atheism is a very narrow definition, or it's, you know, it's a label that doesn't give you very much philosophical detail. Yeah, I don't believe God exists. Well, what do you think about morality? Well, actually, it turns out that if you look at the data, you know, broadly speaking, most philosophers who happen to be atheistic as well will broadly fall into three different moral camps, which is to say that being an atheist doesn't tell you how you should do your morality. And you have to add loads more philosophy onto that to build up a positive, you know, worldview, say humanism or what. But even within humanism, it's like, well, is this particular act morally good or not? And you have to use moral reasoning and moral philosophy. And so if you are receiving your moral code from a 2,000-year-old book that appealed to people in a parochial part of the world in ways that are just morally pretty abhorrent now, then you're going to be constrained and there's going to be a problem, and you're not going to be able to question things and try and work out things on their own merits, because you're kind of trying to receive the conclusion already from this book that's actually morally problematic as it is. And so, yeah, absolutely right. I think we're in a much better position to be able to play around with ideas, and actually, which is more healthy in general, and then to come out with, you know, after a bit of to and fro and arguments, you know, to take the gene editing. You and I could discuss things over several days, and at the end of it, both of us could come out more informed, rather than saying, well, actually, it said this in the Bible, and I'm extracting that kind of teaching from the Bible and applying it to this, and the answer is no, or yes, or whatever.
I would have to, if we talked about that for a day and a half, it would include a presentation of an episode of Max Headroom.
You're going to have to explain that to me.
One of the episodes of Max Headroom was
I don't even know what Max Headroom is.
Oh my. Okay, so Max Headroom was a cyberpunk show that came out in the 80s. It was a joint project between the BBC and ABC, because the BBC did it and put out the pilot, and it was amazing, and so it got picked up as kind of like a American British conglomerate project, right? So it really took off, and it was a really big thing for about a year, and then it just went nowhere. It kind of got tied in with the New Coke campaign, and everyone hated New Coke, and that didn't help.
Fair enough.
But they had this episode, Baby Girl Bags, that was all about how in this dystopian cyberpunk future that the show is set in, people could have designer babies grown in, you know, artificial wombs, and basically just they buy them like puppies from a mill, you know.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, so often science fiction becomes science fact, and then what we think is, you know, conceivable, it becomes, you know, an actuality, or at least, you know, potential to actually do it, if that. So yeah, science fiction is always interesting. Yeah, so I think platforms like OnlySky allow us to freely, you know, no one told me. So when I wrote that gene editing article, no one's told me, you know, I want you to write an article on gene editing that tells us that gene editing is good or that gene editing is bad, right? It's like, yeah, I'm going to write this. Is that all right? Yeah, brilliant. And I'm going to have a look and see what I think. And by the end of it, and hopefully my journey through the article is a journey for the reader who might not know anything about gene editing, and allow them to question, whether it's right or wrong. And in true philosopher style, I ask more questions than I answer. But the idea is it should enlighten us to, or inspire us to think for ourselves and try and work these things out for ourselves. That's a theory.